My father smiled when he abandoned his own mother in an airport. And the worst part? He checked his watch on the way out. I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that doesn't feel real until it happens to someone you love. And if you've ever been the one person in your family who actually shows up, the one who answers the call at 2 in the morning, the one everyone leans on but nobody fights for, then this story is yours too. My name is Dana Granger. I'm a nurse. And I'm going to tell you how a one-way ticket, a piece of airport security footage, and 30 seconds of video destroyed everything my father thought he'd built. But before I do, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what I'm about to share in the last part of this story is the detail that made a judge use the word unfit on the record. And you do not want to miss it. I grew up inside 2 different families that happened to share a last name. The first family lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn mowed in perfect diagonal stripes. My father, Raymond, sold insurance. My mother, Carol, ran the house like a magazine spread. They were the kind of people who loved photographs of the family more than the actual work of being one. The second family was my grandmother, Edith, alone on 160 acres outside Kearney, 2 hours west on I-80, where the land goes wide and flat and the sky feels closer than it should. She was the real one. She taught me to weed a lavender row before I could read. She let me stay up past bedtime shelling peas and hummed old hymns over the sink while I sat on the counter watching her hands. When I grew up and became a geriatric nurse, people told me I had a gift for the elderly. I'd always just say I had Edith. By the time this story begins, I was 32, between travel nursing contracts, living alone in a small rental on the east side of Lincoln. In families like mine, the person with time becomes the person with the job. My grandmother had been moved off the farm a year earlier into my parents' guest room. "So we can help her?" my mother said. I should have heard the quotation marks around help, but I didn't. Not yet. She had Alzheimer's early enough that she could still hold a conversation, late enough that she'd lost the thread of it by the time you reached the middle. And I trusted my parents because they were her son and daughter-in-law. Because that's what you do with the people you love. You give them the benefit of the doubt long after they've stopped earning it. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The strange part started small, the way these things always do. My mother, who had never once cared about property values, suddenly wanted to talk about the farm. Land prices, acreage, whether it was really worth keeping. My father asked me one morning at their kitchen island, casual as asking about a spare key, "Do you happen to know where the deed to the farm is?" I said I didn't. He nodded and didn't look disappointed enough. 2 days later, my mother slid a glossy brochure across the same counter. A memory care community in Arizona. A fountain on the cover. "It would be so good for her," she said. "Professionals around the clock." I'm a nurse. I know what good memory care looks like. I also know what it costs, and that brochure wasn't printing those numbers. So I asked to see the paperwork. I asked which facility, what the admission date was, whether they'd toured it. My mother smiled and changed the subject to the trip. The trip? A family reconciliation to Arizona, the 4 of us plus Grandma, to look at a condo they were thinking of buying. It sounded almost sweet. It sounded like the kind of thing functional families do. I had a bad feeling. The low kind that sits under your ribs and won't name itself. But I had no proof. And you can't refuse a trip framed as healing without looking like the problem. So I said yes. I told myself I'd ask my questions again at the gate. And here's what I want you to hear, because I've replayed it 1,000 times. I saw the warning. I asked the questions. I just didn't know they'd already bought the ticket that made my questions too late. Stay with me. That ticket is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Epley Airfield in Omaha is an hour up the interstate from Lincoln. We made it in good time on a Tuesday morning. My grandmother sat between me and the window of the rental car the whole drive, her fingers cool in mine, smelling of the lavender hand cream she'd used my entire life. At the airport, she got nervous the way she did in crowds, so I kept her close while my parents handled the bags. We ended up in one of the lounges near the gates, the kind with low chairs and a coffee machine and too much glass. My father settled Grandma into a chair by the window. He crouched in front of her, took both her hands, and used his warmest voice, the one he saved for clients. "Just sit here," he said. "We'll check in and come right back." She nodded like a child being good. And I almost let it go, but the feeling under my ribs stood up. So I told my parents I'd be right back, stepped 20 feet away, and made a phone call to the memory care facility on the brochure, the one in Arizona, to confirm the arrangements I'd never been shown. A pleasant woman put me on a brief hold. Then she came back and said the words that rearranged my life. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We have no admission under that name. We have no record of any Granger at all." I turned around mid-sentence. The chairs where my parents had been sitting were empty. Their carry-ons were gone. My grandmother sat alone by the window exactly where she'd been left, her purse in her lap, a folded boarding pass in her hand, waiting for two people who had already walked through security and out of her life. I want to tell you, I screamed. I didn't. Something in me went very quiet and very fast at the same time, the way it does during a code when there's no room left for feeling and only room for doing. I crossed the lounge, but her chair was empty too. For one terrible second, I thought they'd taken her after all, or that she'd wandered. Then I heard it, under the gate announcements and the rolling luggage, low and tuneless and absolutely hers. My grandmother hummed when she was frightened. The same old hymn her whole life, the one my late grandfather used to sing to her in the garden. I followed the sound around a bank of chairs and found her standing near the window, showing a folded photograph to a young woman in airline uniform. "And this is my Walter," she was saying, pointing at a man 6 years dead. "He sings to me." I told the gate agent I was family, that I was a nurse, that I had her. And then my grandmother turned, and the fog lifted the way it sometimes did. Sudden and bright and cruelly brief. She looked at me, really looked, and her whole face softened. "There you are," she said. "I knew you'd come back. I have caught newborns and pressed on stopped hearts and signed the bottoms of death certificates with steady hands." My hands were not steady then. I knelt down in front of her, took the boarding pass out of her fingers, and folded it once into a small, hard square I put in my own pocket. A one-way ticket to a city she had no reason to fly to, bought for a woman who would be found alone and become someone else's problem. Now, here is what I need you to understand before I tell you what I did next. Because the next part of this story is where most people hand the vulnerable person back. They panic, they doubt themselves, they think maybe I misread it, maybe there's an explanation. I am a nurse. I have worked with patients whose families have done terrible things to them and then called it love. I did not doubt what I had just seen. I sat her down, got water into her in small sips, checked her color, checked her pulse at the wrist out of habit. She was rattled, but physically all right. And then I did the thing that nursing beats into you over 1,000 bad nights. I started writing down the time, I opened the notes on my phone, and I logged everything. The hour we'd arrived, the time my father said we'll come right back, the time the facility told me there was no admission, the time I found her alone. I photographed the empty chairs. I photographed the boarding pass front and back before it went in my pocket. Then I called my father. It rang twice and went to voicemail, which means he saw my name and pressed the side button. I called my mother. A text came back within a minute. "Don't make this dramatic. We've earned a rest. She's in good hands with you." Earned a rest. Good hands. As if abandoning a woman with Alzheimer's in an airport were a spa day they'd budgeted for. I sat with my grandmother's head against my shoulder while she hummed herself calm, and I felt something settle in me that has never fully left. Not rage. Rage is loud and useless. This was quieter and far more dangerous to them. It was the cold, clear focus of someone who knows exactly how systems work and has just decided to use every single one of them. They had left a paper trail without meaning to. And I am very, very good with paper. Keep watching, because what I found when I got her to the farm is the piece of evidence that none of them ever imagined I'd find. The first practical problem was simple. I couldn't bring her back to my parents' house in Lincoln. They weren't there. They'd boarded their own flight to Phoenix to look at the retirement condo, the one this whole family trip had really been about. So I drove us the hour back to Lincoln, got her settled on my couch with a blanket and the television low. She slept 12 hours. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew my apartment wouldn't hold. It had stairs. It was strange to her, and strangeness is the enemy in dementia. There was only one place on earth my grandmother's brain still trusted: the farm. I called an elder law attorney in Kearney named Gene Howerin before I did anything else. A man in his late 60s who'd been practicing in Buffalo County since before I was born, and who answered his own phone. I told him everything in order. the way you give a shift report. He let me finish without interrupting. Then he said, "You did 3 things right in the first hour that most families never think to do. You wrote down the times, you took photographs, and you kept her with you instead of handing her back." Then quieter. "Tell me you kept the boarding pass." I told him it was in my wallet that very minute. We drove to the farm, 2 hours west on E80, the flat gold fields rolling by, Kearney exit coming up like an old promise. The key was where it had always been, under the loose brick by the propane tank. Inside, the air smelled like dust and dried lavender. My grandmother walked in, set her purse on the same hook she'd used for 50 years, and her shoulders came down 2 inches. "I'll start the coffee," she said, clear as a bell, and went to a kitchen she suddenly remembered. I stood in the doorway and watched her hands find the percolator without her eyes. The disease takes so much, but the body holds the places we loved the longest. Then I started clearing the kitchen table, and underneath a stack of mail and circulars, I found something that stopped my hands cold. A glossy folder from a realty company in Kearney, Prairie Line Realty. Inside was a full comparative market analysis on the farm, all 160 acres, with an estimated sale price that had a comma in a place that made my stomach drop. Clipped to it was a draft listing agreement, half filled out and unsigned, dated 3 weeks earlier, with my father's name typed in the seller line. 3 weeks before the trip, before the smiles, before he crouched down and promised he'd come right back. He had already walked a stranger across my grandmother's land, taken photographs of her home, and priced it for sale. He had never once asked the woman who owned it. He hadn't asked her because he couldn't. She couldn't understand the question anymore, which raised the only question that mattered to me, standing there in her kitchen with her humming in the next room. If my grandmother couldn't consent to sell her own farm, then by what authority did my father think he could sell it for her? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew exactly who to call to find out. Subscribe right now if you haven't yet, because what happens when my father finds out I have this folder, and what he does next, is something I never saw coming. My parents were back from Arizona within 3 days, and the phone calls started immediately. My mother went first, all warmth and reason. "Sweetheart, this has gone far enough. Bring her back to Lincoln. You're not equipped to do this alone." I almost laughed. "I do this for a living." My father took a harder line. "You don't get to just take her, Dana. There are decisions being made for her welfare, and you're interfering." But it was my Uncle Wes who told the actual truth. Wes ran an auto shop in Grand Island and had money problems the family pretended not to see. He called me himself, skipping pleasantries. "Look, the farm has to sell this quarter. It just does. Whatever you think you're doing, you're costing all of us." I asked him as evenly as I could how exactly they planned to sell a farm that belonged to a living woman who hadn't agreed to anything. He went quiet, then said something that turned that low feeling under my ribs into a plan. "Your dad's handling that. There's a process. We just need her looked at by a doctor. Declared, then it's clean." Declared? They wanted her declared incompetent, not to protect her, but to take the wheel of her estate and drive it straight to a closing table. My mother let the same word slip on the next call, dressed up nicer. "A competency evaluation? It's just paperwork, Dana." It is never just paperwork, and I was about to make sure they learned that the expensive way. I didn't argue with them anymore after that. Arguing is what they wanted, because an argument is just noise, and noise goes nowhere. Instead, I let Howard teach me the rules. All of them. He poured bad coffee and walked me through it slowly. My grandmother, he explained, no longer had the capacity to sign anything. That door was closed. She couldn't grant me power of attorney any more than she could sell the farm herself. The only lawful path ran through the courthouse, in 2 parts. Guardianship, which is authority over the person, where she lives and how she's cared for, and conservatorship, which is authority over the property, the land, the money. A court appoints both, and the court's only loyalty is to her best interest. People assume the son gets it automatically, he told me. He doesn't. The judge weighs who is suitable. The court can pass right over a closer relative if that person is unfit, or if their interests collide with hers. Then he said the sentence that turned the whole thing around in my chest. A conservator can't simply sell a ward's real estate to pay his own debts. Selling her land takes a separate petition and a judge's approval. No court in this state signs off on selling grandma's farm to bail out her son's auto shop. I sat there and let it sink in. Their entire scheme rested on a foundation that didn't exist. And the act of abandoning her, the thing they'd done to remove her from the picture, was the single best evidence I could possibly bring to a judge deciding who was fit to protect her. Their weapon and my weapon were about to turn out to be the same thing. They just didn't know I was the one holding it. But before any of that could happen, I had to survive the family. My parents got to the relatives first, and they were always better at the story than at the truth. Within a week, half the family believed I had taken Grandma in some fit of drama, that I'd isolated her from her loving son and daughter-in-law, that I was unstable, overworked, maybe a little unwell. My father is very good at looking concerned. My mother cries on cue. Against two people who look that good in church clothes, a tired nurse who works nights doesn't stand a chance in the rumor mill. My phone filled with messages from aunts and cousins, some confused, some cold, and I sat in my grandmother's kitchen that night feeling more outnumbered than I'd ever felt in my life. No allies. I had spent my whole life being the one others leaned on, and I'd never once practiced leaning back. But then I remembered the one thing they kept saying. They kept saying she wouldn't know. And I started to understand that they had no idea what she knew. I went back through every message from the weeks before the trip, reading them the way you read a chart on a patient who crashed, looking for the moment it all went wrong. And there it was. A voicemail my mother had left the night before we drove to Omaha, one I'd only half listened to at the time. She'd been talking fast, the way she does when she's convinced herself of something. Honestly, Dana, the doctors say she's barely there. She won't even know we're gone. She won't even know we're gone. And there was a text thread in a family group my father had never removed me from, sent to Wes weeks earlier, casual as anything. Don't worry about Mom. The farm's basically mine anyway. Just need to move her along. Move her along. Like cattle, like inventory, like a chair you carry to the curb. And underneath the disgust, something useful clarified for me. This wasn't a family that had cracked under the unbearable weight of caregiving, though they would certainly tell the judge it was. This was a calculation made in advance and in writing. What they'd forgotten is that I do math too. And the most expensive miscalculation they ever made was the assumption hiding under every cruel word. They thought she wouldn't know. She knew exactly who walked away and who came back. Stay with me, because what the airport security camera captured is something even I wasn't prepared for. I reported the abandonment to Adult Protective Services the very next day. My caseworker was a woman named Marion Doyle with 30 years of watching families do terrible things to their elders, and nothing in my story surprised her, which was somehow the most chilling part. She moved fast. She requested the airport security footage before it could cycle off the system. And a week later, she called and asked me to come in and watch it with her. I want to be honest about what I expected. I expected confusion. A crowded lounge, a misunderstanding, maybe even an accident I could eventually forgive. That is not what the camera showed. The camera showed my father crouching in front of my grandmother and taking her hands, exactly as I remembered. It showed him stand. It showed him say something and pat her shoulder. Then it showed him turn and walk away. And here is the detail I will carry to my own grave. Halfway across that lounge, with his mother sitting alone behind him, my father lifted his wrist and checked his watch. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was on schedule. My mother appeared at the edge of the frame, glanced back once, and the two of them walked together towards security without breaking stride. The way you leave a gate. Not the way you leave your mother. Marion let the clip run to the end, then froze it on the empty chair. I've done this a long time, she said quietly. That's not a family that fell apart. That's a plan. I asked her to print the still of him checking his watch. I put it in my folder. The folder was getting thick, and every single page in it was something my parents had created themselves and handed to me without realizing. The listing agreement, the voicemail, the text, the footage, the ticket. I hadn't dug up a single secret. I had simply refused to throw away anything they gave me. And then they gave me one more gift. They decided to take me to court. They struck first, the way people do when they think speed looks like confidence. I was served on a Thursday, standing in my grandmother's kitchen with flour on my hands. My father and my uncle had filed a petition for guardianship and conservatorship of Edith Granger. Their petition named me as the problem. According to the paperwork, I had removed the ward from her established residence, isolated her from her immediate family, and was exercising undue influence over a vulnerable adult. Likely, it implied, to get my hands on her estate. I had to read it twice because the gall of it took a minute to register. The two people who had bought a one-way ticket and left her in an airport were petitioning a court to protect her from me. When I called Howard in something close to panic, he sounded almost pleased. "Good," he said. "Let them file. Now there's a hearing." Now, a judge has to look at all of it in one room on the record, and Dana, everything they did to her gets entered into evidence whether they like it or not. I gained 2 witnesses in the weeks before the hearing, and neither one was family. The first was Teresa, the gate agent, the young woman my grandmother had shown the photograph to in the lounge. Marion had tracked her down through the airline. Teresa remembered the whole thing because how do you forget it? She remembered an elderly woman, clearly confused, sitting alone. And she remembered what my father had said to her at the desk on his way past, almost as an aside, that in case anyone asked, someone would be along for the older lady. Someone. Not my granddaughter is right there. Just someone eventually to deal with the older lady. Teresa agreed to say so under oath. My second witness was Mr. Vogel, the Grangers' nearest neighbor for 60 years. He couldn't speak to airports or paperwork, but he could speak to who Edith was and who had shown up. He told me that Edith had asked about me by name all year, even as the rest of her slipped. Even in the house in Lincoln, when my parents had told her I was too busy to visit. They had told her I'd abandoned her. While planning to abandon her themselves, she had hummed her way through it, holding on to a granddaughter she'd been told wasn't coming. And then, one day in an airport, that granddaughter came back. I had to sit down when he told me that. My mother came to the farm alone, a week before the hearing. I almost didn't let her in, but she stood on the porch looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, and some stubborn part of me still wanted to understand. So I put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in my life, she told me the truth, or her version of it. "You don't know what this year was," she said. "She got up at 3 every night. She didn't know me. She called me a thief in my own house. I gave up everything to care for her, and she looked at me like a stranger. And I won't lie to you, because this story isn't honest if I do. For a moment, I felt for her. Caregiving without help breaks people. The exhaustion in her face was real. The grief was real. If she had said the next words and stopped there, I might have found a way toward forgiveness. She didn't. She wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and said, 'So you have to understand.' She wouldn't have known the difference. She won't even know we were gone." There it was again. The same math. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking me to agree that what they'd done was reasonable because the cost to her had been high. I set down my cup. "Mom," I said, "she knew exactly who walked away, and she knew exactly who came back. You still don't understand what the problem is, do you?" She left without finishing her tea. I never doubted again. The night before the hearing, my grandmother had one of her hard nights. She woke a little after midnight, frightened, asking for Walter, asking why the house was so dark. I sat on the edge of her bed, took her hands, and worked the lavender cream into them. The same scent she had once rubbed into mine after a day of weeding. The world had turned all the way around, so that the child was now the one comforting the grandmother. She calmed under my hands. Then she started to hum that old hymn, low and certain, and without quite deciding to, I hummed it with her. The two of us in the dark, in a farmhouse her family was trying to sell out from under her. At the end of it, she looked at me with a flash of that terrible, beautiful clarity and asked a question I will hear for the rest of my life. "Are they coming back?" she said. I knew exactly who she meant, even if she didn't. I held her hands a little tighter and told her the truth. The only promise I've ever been completely sure I could keep. "No," I said. "But I am. Every time." She nodded like that was enough and slept. I sat there until the window went gray, knowing that in a few hours I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. The paper would do it for me. The Buffalo County Courthouse is a solid old building with marble floors that carry sound. On the morning of the hearing, the hallway was full of my family. My father wore the gray suit he saved for funerals and big sales. My mother wore pearls and the carefully composed face of a woman who has been wronged. Uncle Wes paced near the water fountain, checking his phone every 30 seconds. And there, against the far wall on a wooden bench, sat my grandmother in the blue dress she liked, with Marian Doyle on one side and Mr. Howard on the other. She sat perfectly still in the middle of all of it, hands folded in her lap, humming. That same old hymn, soft and steady, filling the hallway like it was a garden and not a courthouse. My father wouldn't look at her. My mother couldn't stop looking at her. The contrast wasn't lost on a single person standing there. The people who claimed to be falling apart from worry over her couldn't stand still. The woman they'd abandoned was the calmest soul in the building. Their lawyer was good. He painted a portrait of a devoted son and his loyal wife, a couple who had sacrificed their own retirement to care for an ailing mother, only to have a resentful and isolated niece swoop in, snatch the vulnerable woman away, and position herself to control an estate. He used words like unstable and undue influence and deeply concerning. He noted that I worked nights, lived alone, and had no children of my own, as if my whole life were evidence of a deficiency. My father took the stand and was magnificent at it. He let his voice crack at exactly the right moment. He talked about how hard the year had been, how worried he was for his mother's safety, how he only wanted what was best for her. He never once mentioned an airport. My mother dabbed her eyes. Wes nodded too vigorously. I sat at our table with my grandmother's hand in mine, her thumb moving in slow circles against my palm, and I felt the courtroom tilting their way. This is where the old version of me would have stood up and started yelling. But I had learned something in that lounge and every night since. The loud one in the room is rarely the one telling the truth. When the judge turned to me and asked whether I wished to respond, I stood up quietly and I opened the binder. I told the court I was a registered nurse with 12 years in geriatric care, and I entered my license and credentials into the record because suitability was the question and competence was my answer. Then, one document at a time, I let my family's own work speak. The listing agreement from Prairie Line Realty dated 3 weeks before the so-called family trip, with my father's name in the seller line. The airline records showing a one-way ticket purchased 11 days before the trip in my grandmother's name to a city she had no connection to and no one waiting in. My mother's voicemail played in open court, her own voice saying the words, "She won't even know we're gone." The physician's capacity evaluation, my dated care log every hard night in plain ink. And then last, I asked the court to watch 30 seconds of video. The bailiff dimmed the lights. The footage played. My father crouching, taking her hands, standing, walking away. And halfway across that lounge, with his mother sitting alone behind him, lifting his wrist to check his watch. Someone in the gallery gasped. I didn't turn around. Marian Doyle testified next, calm and devastating, to her findings and to 30 years of telling the difference between a family that breaks and a family that plans. Then Teresa, the gate agent, took the stand in a shaking voice and told the court that the well-dressed man had assured her someone would be along for the older lady. When I sat down, the courtroom that had been tilting toward them an hour earlier had gone completely, perfectly still. And that is when my father broke. Because men like my father can survive anything except being seen. He came up out of his chair before his lawyer could stop him. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he shouted. "She's manipulating all of you. She's turned this into a circus to steal what's rightfully mine." Rightfully mine. The whole room heard it. And Wes panicked and said the rest out loud, the part their lawyer had spent weeks burying. "We needed that sale, Ray. We're out of time. The bank's not going to wait." There it was, in front of the judge, in their own mouths. Not her welfare, the sale, the debt, the clock. I stood back up and I went the other way. The angrier he got, the quieter I became, until the whole courtroom had to lean in to hear me, which meant they leaned away from him. I looked at my father and said evenly, "You told her? Just sit here. We'll check in and come right back." I let it land. "You did come back, for the farm, not for her." Then I turned to my mother, who had stopped dabbing her eyes. "You said she wouldn't even know you were gone." I held her gaze until she dropped it. She knew exactly who walked away, and she knew exactly who came back. My father had nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. His own lawyer had a hand on his arm, and my grandmother, through all of it, kept humming, soft and unbothered, the one calm thing in a room full of people losing control. Judge Peterson ruled from the bench, which Howard told me afterwards she rarely does. She found that Edith Granger was indeed incapacitated and in need of protection, the one thing both sides had agreed on. Then she found that the petitioners were unsuitable to serve. In plain words, she said the evidence showed they had not acted in the ward's interest, but in their own financial interest. That abandoning a vulnerable adult in an airport was, in her words, as clear a disqualification as this court has seen. That a man who would do that to his mother could not be trusted with her person or her property. She denied their petition in full. She appointed me, Dana Granger, as both guardian and conservator, with authority to decide my grandmother's care and manage her property for her benefit and hers alone. And she made it clear, looking directly at my father, that no petition to sell the farm to satisfy anyone's debts would find a friendly ear in her courtroom. Then she directed that the APS findings, the airport footage, and the airline records be forwarded to the county attorney's office to review whether criminal charges for abandonment and neglect of a vulnerable adult should follow. I never asked for that part. I only ever asked to keep my grandmother. But the law, it turns out, has its own opinions about leaving an 82-year-old woman in an airport. My father did not look at me as he left the courtroom. He did not look at his mother either. That part hurt in a way I hadn't expected. He had walked in certain the closest blood would win. He walked out having learned that blood was never the question. The question was, who showed up? The fallout was real and measurable, and none of it required a raised voice. With the farm frozen and no sale to count on, Uncle Wes lost the auto shop within 2 months. My parents never bought the condo in Scottsdale. The down payment they'd been so sure of had been 160 acres that were never theirs to spend. The story my parents had told so well for so long finally met the one thing it couldn't survive: being looked at in full. I didn't gloat. There's no satisfaction in watching your own father become a cautionary tale. There's only a strange, tired grief underneath the relief. Spring came on the way it does out there, all at once. After months of nothing and the first warm Saturday, I took her out to the back where her lavender roses had gone gray and wild. I cut them back hard, the way she'd taught me, scared the whole time I was killing them. She sat in a kitchen chair I'd carried out to the yard, watching my hands, and told me again that lavender is the one plant that smells better after you cut it down to almost nothing. Within a few weeks, there was green where the gray had been, and the bees found us. And the whole backlot started to smell like my entire childhood. One morning, I came out with 2 cups of coffee and found her already there, face turned up to the sun. When she heard me, she opened her eyes and looked at me with that rare, clear gaze the disease still gave back now and then, like a gift it couldn't fully take. "There you are," she said. I knew you'd come back. She had said the same words in an airport lounge on the worst day of my life. This time, I sat down in the grass beside her chair, handed her the warm cup, and let myself believe her. I left the hospital system that year. I used what I knew to build something small in Kearney. A coffee shop, mostly, but really a memory cafe. A place where families with someone like my grandmother can come and sit and be known and not be a burden to anyone. There's lavender in pots in the front window, cut from her rose. And sometimes an old song plays behind the counter, a man named Walter singing in a garden. If there is one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's this. Family isn't the people who promise they'll be right back. It's the ones who actually come back and keep coming back. On the worst nights, when no one is keeping score and there's nothing left to gain. That is my story. One lounge, one promise nobody meant to keep, and one quiet woman who refused to throw away anything they handed her. If this reminded you to check on the relative everyone forgets, or to ask your parents where the important papers are, do it today. Don't wait. And if you know someone carrying their whole family alone right now, share this story so they know they're not. Drop a comment below, subscribe so you never miss these stories, and I'll see you next time.